Today we're going to finish up with the circulatory system. Basically, we will talk a little bit more about the heart and blood vessels. Then we'll talk about some cardiovascular disease, and then we'll be finished. Ready to move on. So, you guys in the sheet, or the packet we did the other day, kind of got a real basic model of the heart. You know, like a box showing how blood is circulated. So, the heart actually is more complex. When we think about the chambers of the heart, there's 4 chambers, obviously. Remember, when we're speaking anatomically and you're looking at something on a paper, the sides are reversed because you always speak anatomically about if that part were in an organism, you're looking into their ventral side. This is my right side, so that's my right atrium. This is my left side, that's my left ventricle. But when you look at it, when you're facing the organism, it looks reversed. So the atrium is the chamber where blood enters. That's what an atrium means, it's an entryway. So if we start here with the right atrium, so the right side of the heart deals with what kind of blood? Deoxygenated. So the right side of the heart, the right atrium, collects all the blood from the various parts of your body. The inferior vena cava collects blood from the lower portions of the human body. The superior vena cava brings down deoxygenated blood from the upper parts of the body. It all collects in the right atrium. From there, when the heart contracts, it gets forced into the right ventricle. It goes through this valve, a one-way door basically, the tricuspid valve, that prevents blood from going back in the other way. So it gets forced into the right ventricle. When the ventricle contracts, that blood goes through another valve, the pulmonary valve, into the pulmonary artery. And where is this blood destined for? The lungs. And this blood is deoxygenated, needs to make its way back to the lungs to sort of be recharged. Some of it goes to the left lung, some of it goes to the right lung. That blood gets oxygenated, gets rid of its carbon dioxide, and then comes back to the heart. And when it comes back, it's coming back to the left side. That blood is now oxygenated, and it comes back to the left side. It comes through pulmonary veins from each side, all collects in the left atrium. Through another valve into the left ventricle. When that left ventricle contracts, it forces blood through the aortic valve into the aorta, which then will distribute this blood to various parts of the body. So that's the sort of overall pattern of circulation. It's a figure 8 pattern. So it goes from the right side of the heart to the lungs, left side of the heart to body tissues, back to the right side of the heart. So we have this circuit, this figure 8, repeated over and over again. Now, we'll often say it goes to the body. What we really mean is just gets pumped out to all of the tissue throughout the body. When we say it goes to the body, might it be going to the brain or the skin or the digestive system or all sorts of places. That's what we mean when we say body. So that's the overall picture of circulation in humans. So let's talk a little bit about the vessels, the tubes that carry this blood from place to place. There's 3 main types of blood vessels: arteries, veins, and capillaries. Talk about each of them. Arteries are the blood vessels that are responsible for taking the blood away from the heart. A in artery goes with away. They bring blood away from the heart. So most of the time, what type of blood is this? Mostly it's oxygenated. There's only one exception. Because that blood, most of the arteries leaving the heart are headed to all the parts of the body carrying oxygenated blood. The exception is with the pulmonary artery. Because where is that blood headed? To the lungs. That's what pulmonary is. Typically, our arteries are located sort of deeper in our body. They're not on the surface. Like when you look at the back of your hand, if you have lots of veins that you can see through your skin, those are veins. Those aren't arteries. Most arteries are sort of tucked away inside our body a little deeper, protected a little bit, because damage to an artery can be very dangerous. because they have high pressure. Person has damage to an artery, it bleeds extensively, and can be life-threatening. So they're deeper in our body. They are made of smooth muscle, like all blood vessels, but they have thick, strong, elastic walls. Our arteries have to withstand the pressure of our heart forcing blood into the arteries every second or so. So they swell up a little bit every time. As your heart forces blood into them, those arteries swell up. And when you feel your pulse in your neck, what you're really touching is an artery. So in your neck, you have your carotid artery, bringing blood up to your brain, your head. And so when you put your fingers in here, you can feel every time your heart beats, that artery expands a little bit. You can feel it with your fingers. That's what your pulse is. So there are some diseases of the arteries. An aneurysm you may have heard of. An aneurysm is a swelling in an artery. Okay? And an aneurysm happens when the tissue becomes weak. Okay? It sort of gets stretched out. And it's an area that might be susceptible to damage, okay, because of that. Also, atherosclerosis is when those arteries can start to become clogged with buildup of plaques and other fatty substances that reduce the flow of blood through those arteries. Okay? As these substances build up inside the arteries, less blood can get through. They can become so thick that they can eventually block the flow of blood completely. And if that happens in an artery that feeds your heart with blood, it can be very dangerous. We'll talk more about it. So the first artery, the largest artery that leaves your heart is the aorta. So like your heart would be here under here. It's not like open like this. So your left ventricle pumps all of the blood from the left side of your heart through your aorta. What happens is as the blood's traveling through the aorta, it starts to branch off. These two branches are the first areas to receive blood, and these are extremely important because they're the coronary arteries. These are the arteries that actually give the heart itself the blood supply that it needs. If there's any damage or blockages in these coronary arteries, that can be dangerous. The blood continues. This is called the ascending aorta, the part that rises. And then it starts branching off. These branches go down the right side of the body. The subclavian artery, okay, is the one that sort of loops around your heart and leads down your arm. The carotid arteries are the arteries that bring blood up to your head. The right side, there's the left side carotid artery. This brings the blood down to the left arm. And then the aorta loops around. This is called the descending aorta. Goes behind the heart, and that has branches off of that bring the blood to your torso, continues down the femoral arteries, which carry blood down your legs, and they continue branching off, so you have a distribution of blood throughout the body. So once the blood is brought through the arteries to the various parts of the body, eventually it needs to get back to the heart. And it gets there through veins. Veins carry the blood back to the heart. Arteries carry blood away, veins carry blood to the heart. So typically, what type of blood do they contain? It's coming from the various parts of the body. Deoxygenated. The exception again is the pulmonary blood, because that's coming from the lungs. Veins are often, some are deep in our body, but also some of them are at the surface. They are much thinner than arteries. They're not as strong. And that's because they don't have to withstand high pressure like the arteries do. By the time the blood gets into the veins, its pressure has been decreased quite a bit. And because of that, because they don't have this high pressure forcing blood through them, they need a special structure to prevent blood from flowing backwards. And those structures are these valves. Inside of veins are these little flaps. And what happens is they allow blood to go through the vein back to the heart, but if blood were to start to flow backwards, those flaps close and the blood can't go in the opposite direction. Sometimes those valves break down and don't fully close properly, or they become damaged. And that's what leads to this issue of varicose veins, if you've heard of that. That's when the valves inside of the vein are sort of broken down and blood can sort of collect and pool in those areas. Oftentimes people get these in their legs, especially as they age and get older. They sort of swell up. That's because the valves inside of those veins have been damaged. So if arteries bring the blood away from the heart, veins bring it back to the heart. Connecting between the two of them are the capillaries. Capillaries are sort of the intermediary. So the blood that enters the capillaries typically is oxygenated, and the blood leaving the capillaries is typically deoxygenated, except for the lungs. Basically, anywhere you have body tissue, you have a network of capillaries surrounding that tissue. If you were able to strip away all the tissue of a person and only look at the capillaries, you would see an exact model of their shape. Because all of our tissue needs this supply of blood through these capillaries. They're very, very thin, very, very small. The wall of capillaries is only a single cell thick. They're so narrow that blood cells have to move through single file, one at a time. So you see here in this diagram, blood cells going through this capillary. And as they pass through the capillary, materials can diffuse back and forth. So the oxygen that these red blood cells are carrying, as it moves over this body tissue, some of that oxygen can diffuse into the cells of the body. Some nutrients can diffuse into those body cells. At the same time, the blood can pick up waste products, can pick up carbon dioxide that these cells have produced, can pick up waste products that these cells have produced, and then start bringing those through the veins back to the heart. So we have arteries, which connect to capillaries, which merge back into veins to bring blood back to the heart. So we see that sort of pattern there. So sometimes if those capillaries get damaged due to trauma or something, that's what leads to bruising, blood sort of leaking out of those capillaries, causing a bruise. Also, certain diseases can damage those capillaries. Here's just another sort of diagram showing what it looks like. We have the arteries bringing the blood into this. We call this a capillary network, capillary bed. See, it becomes very narrow. Blood cells are moving single file. As they move past this tissue, a couple things happen. Materials diffuse out of the blood. Nutrients, oxygen, some materials diffuse into the blood, like waste products. Also, some of the plasma of the blood is forced out of the capillaries, and that's why there's high pressure coming in, but lower pressure as the blood leaves, because some of the volume of that blood has been decreased. Any questions about blood vessels? All right, so let's talk a little bit about cardiovascular disease. It's very common, cardiovascular disease. Chances are you know somebody that had hypertension or heart condition or something like that. So one type of cardiovascular disease is hypertension. This is high blood pressure. And this is the most common type of cardiovascular disease. And it's when the pressure in your arteries is higher than normal. Remember that? Talked the other day about blood pressure and measuring it using that blood pressure cuff. Well, if the pressure in those arteries is too high, it can cause damage to the arteries. It can cause damage to the tissues around it. Different things cause high blood pressure. Stress, for example. I've heard people say, "Oh, you're giving me high blood pressure," or something like that. That's because the hormones our body releases in a time of stress, one of the effects of those hormones is to elevate our blood pressure. Diet. depending on the types of foods we eat. Certain types of foods can increase our blood pressure. Other types of foods can decrease blood pressure. Hereditary. Some types of blood pressure, we inherit a predisposition to high blood pressure from our parents. Smoking increases blood pressure. Aging increases blood pressure. There's lots of factors here. Atherosclerosis is the buildup of these deposits of plaques, they're called sometimes, on the walls of arteries, and that can lead to blockages in which blood flow is reduced to a certain part of the body, and therefore it's more difficult for blood to get to the tissues where it needs to go. A heart attack. Heart attacks can be caused by various things. One common thing that happens is the arteries that lead to the heart, the coronary arteries, can become blocked. And because the heart muscle itself is not getting its supply of blood and oxygen, the heart can't function, eventually it shuts down, and then the rest of the body can't get the material it needs. So often, as there are signs and symptoms of issues with the coronary arteries, a person may get chest pain, may have pain radiating down their arm, may be difficult to exert themselves because their heart's not getting the supply of oxygen that it needs. Anemia is when the blood itself doesn't carry enough oxygen. Sometimes because there's a genetic disease that leads to the hemoglobin being formed incorrectly. Sometimes due to lack of iron to form that hemoglobin. And when a person has anemia, they don't have enough oxygen. They get tired very easily and fatigued. Leukemia is a type of cancer. It's a cancer of the bone marrow. And so we know that our blood cells are produced in our bone marrow. And so if a person has cancer, it means cells within the bone marrow are reproducing. The cell cycle is broken down. Often this leads to an abnormally high level of white blood cells because the white blood cells are produced by the bone marrow. That cell cycle is unchecked, and people often might have a low red blood cell count if they had leukemia because of the overproduction of white blood cells. Leukemia is the most common type of cancer in children. If you ever heard of somebody with leukemia, some of the treatments, they might have a bone marrow transplant. They would try and put healthy bone marrow back into their body to help create normal white blood cells. Things like that. So we have a few diagrams. We'll talk about a couple things. So let's start with the heart attack. So if we look at the heart muscle itself, these are the coronary arteries. This is an actual image showing these are the arteries that are supplying the heart muscle with oxygen. If they are damaged and oxygen is not getting, for example, this diagram, this section of the heart muscle is not getting a supply of blood due to a blockage. It could be a blood clot that's formed and been trapped in the coronary artery. It could be due to blockage, due to buildup of cholesterol and so forth. So if it's not getting the oxygen it needs, the muscle can't function, and it will eventually die. So what do they do? What are the treatments? Well, a couple things. If a person had signs, symptoms that they might have some sort of heart disease, one step that doctors will take is to do a capillarization. And what they do is they actually take a wire sort of tube that they can guide through the body. They insert it into the femoral artery, and then they sort of work this wire all the way up through their torso. They guide it into the aorta, loop it around into a coronary artery. And then they can do a few things. So one thing they can do is inject a dye and then look at it. That's how these images are made. And they can see if there's any blockages in the coronary arteries. Another thing, if they do find a blockage like this, sometimes you may, if you know somebody that had heart disease, they may talk about, well, the coronary artery was 80% blocked or 95% blocked. And what they're talking about is how much of the blood flow was restricted. So if they find a blockage like this plaque here, they actually can insert a tiny little balloon at the end of the wire, get it into this buildup, inflate the balloon, and it will sort of open up that passageway, sort of smush that plaque against the walls of the artery, hopefully restoring better flow of blood through that area. Another thing they can do is put in a permanent stent. If you've heard of that. So a stent is basically a little mesh wire tube. They can get it also into the coronary arteries at the end of this catheter. And it starts off, it's closed up. They get it to the right spot, and then they inflate a tiny balloon. The stent opens up, locks in place, and then it sort of reinforces the coronary artery in that area so that blood can continue to flow there. They're often medicated so that other plaques don't build up there. But sometimes those methods don't work. That's a good question. Why do they do it there? I'm not sure. I think maybe it's the easiest to access, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Good question. So if those methods don't work and they're not able to reestablish the flow of blood to the heart, then a doctor might have to do bypass surgery. In coronary bypass surgery, doctors sort of reroute blood vessels to go around the blockage. So this would be a before bypass surgery, and this person has a blockage here in this area. So these arteries are not getting enough supply of blood. This part of the heart is being damaged. Okay? So what they do is they can take a blood vessel. Often they might do with a vein from your leg. They will take a vein from someone's leg, basically cut it out. Then they will sort of paste it in. They'll suture it to the aorta here, and then they bring it down, connect the other end to the bottom of the coronary artery. So now blood flow that goes through the aorta, some of that blood comes down, goes around this blockage, and now these parts of the heart can have a supply of blood again. The other way they sometimes do is they take this artery, it's already attached, it's a mammary artery, it goes to our chest area, and then they disconnect that artery from the chest, and they reconnect it here on this other coronary artery. So now as blood flows through it, again, blood goes past the blockage, reestablishing the flow of blood to that part. A couple other things about these pictures. So this is showing normal red blood cells. This is showing a person that has sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease is a genetic disease. Okay? More common people of African descent, and there's a reason for that we'll talk about in a minute. But in sickle cell disease, the hemoglobin molecule, because of a mutation, is misshapen. It's not made correctly. And so it makes the blood vessels shaped like these little sort of crescents. Obviously, those crescents can't carry oxygen properly. They sometimes build up, okay, and cut off the flow of blood to a certain area. Causes a whole host of health problems that go along with this. One interesting thing about sickle cell disease, however, is that a person that's born with only one gene for sickle cell disease, they're a carrier, their blood cells are mainly healthy, so they don't have the symptoms and the effects of sickle cell disease, but scientists have found it gives them a resistance to malaria. And so part of the reason that this disease has evolved is because people that are carriers do have that resistance, and malaria is a disease that affects millions of people. So being a carrier actually confers an advantage on people. And last, this is showing what a blood smear might look like of a person with normal blood cell count versus an indication of leukemia, where you have an excess of white blood cells. Some of them may be misshapen, misformed, too many nuclei, and a decrease in the number of red blood cells. Any questions about cardiovascular disease?